calm down, fancy. Here you go. Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Modern Golden Age podcast. My name is Joe, and today I have with me Brian. Brian, thank you so much for being here. How are you?
Thank you so much for having me. Yeah, I'm doing really well this morning.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, we've been trying to set this bad boy up in for a while, but I'm so glad that we finally did. As I was mentioning to you before, I'm really excited to talk with you because I've been wanting this to have you since we met on Inter Intellect on and we in that salon. We discussed truth and different authors, and I do
Mm-hmm.
know that from 2019, and correct me if I'm wrong, to 2020, you dedicated a lot of time thinking about a specific philosopher, right? Which was Khun. I think I'm
Yes.
pronouncing it right. So I was wondering if you, first of all, we could start there. Like, what made you spend that amount of time thinking about one philosopher, and also what's next after doing that with Khun? Like, what's the next philosopher that you want to explore?
Yeah, that's great. So I got really interested in Thomas Kuhn in 2019, as you say, and that was as a side effect of being interested in revolutions, which is when society makes big shifts. And in my view, this probably does relate almost immediately to golden ages, actually. And so it was just the question of under what circumstances do big societal changes take place?
Mm,
And since I was interested in this concept, not just the big revolutions that we think of in terms of, Russian Revolution or French Revolution, but also just like revolutionary sort of transformations that happen over history. And so then I was looking for books about this, and Thomas Kuhn's The Structure of Scientific Revolutions came up. And so he's writing about how science comes to change its mind under periods of uncertainty.
mm,
And that's how I originally got interested in him. I should say that in those, even during that time, I was also interested in a lot of other philosophers. So
mm.
I've kind of gone, I tend to go all over the place. And
Yeah.
right now, if I had to ask or if I had to answer which philosopher I'm interested in at the moment, it's probably Nietzsche, actually.
Mm.
And there is a kind of relationship between those two, even though it's very unlikely that Thomas Kuhn, who was an American writing in the 1960s, would ever have read Nietzsche, who's German,
Mm.
writing in the sort of 1870s, 1880s.
Yeah. Yeah, and like one of the things that I understood with you is that basically he part of his point was that science revolutions happen like without this logical structure or narrative, but then history gets written and it gets written in a way that basically connects them, right? And
Yes.
so I was wondering, like, do you think that we do that in our lives as well? What I mean by no, so go ahead. You already have an answer.
Oh, I absolutely do. I think it's really incisive and impressive that you made that connection. Kuhn does think that choices between worldviews, he kind of sees, you could say paradigm scientific sort of subspecialties or something like that, or you could just say worldviews. They are mutually incompatible, and therefore the choice between them can't be rational because the
Mm,
systems within themselves have to be rational.
mm,
But in order to make the choice between systems, you kind of can't make it at the rational level. And that makes him sound kind of irrational, which is he's definitely not. But you can compare it to like the choice between political systems. And for example, if you have a political revolution, you're changing from one way of doing politics to another way of doing politics. But almost by definition, if you have a revolution, that choice is not made at the level of politics. It's made at a level above between two things that you can compare their results, but you can't sort of decide to adopt a completely different political system from within the framework of another political system, if
yeah,
that makes sense. So when a
yeah,
revolution occurs, it
mm,
has to be at this level outside. It's extra political. Does that make sense? And so, in a
yeah,
certain sense, the choice between worldviews is also extra rational, which is not
mm,
to say that they're all alike, because that's definitely not true, but that they have a complicated series of trade-offs that you can only sort of make the decision within sort of an environment or context. Does that make sense?
Yeah, a lot. And like one of my okay, shifting to one of the things that I really admire about you, and I thought about that on our salon the first time that I saw you, was the care that you use while considering ideas. So what I mean by this is that, and everyone that listens to your podcast, which we'll get into, can understand this. Like you're one of the people that I follow that actually, and this is my personal belief, but that actually cares a lot about ideas and is very thoughtful about them, right? And
Mm.
so I guess that my question, and everyone listening to this podcast just realized that by your answer. So how, I think my question would be, and I know it's a big general question, but like, how do you explain your relationship with ideas?
That's a great question, and I think I'm going to go back to your earlier question, which
Mm,
is the question of, does this issue of worldviews, or let's say scientific paradigms, does it also apply in the individual's life? And my
mm,
view is that it does. So, in other words, I have gone through many different periods of my life and been very interested in, if not, major Western philosophers per se, then many different worldviews. And I've come out with a kind of humility about the extent to which any of them could exhaustively explain something in my life. So, in other words, thinking about how different, completely conflicting worldviews might sort of each contribute to my overall understanding of the world. And so you can
mm,
see the kind of analogy to the scientific paradigms, which is that it might be a mutually exclusive view. Like I can't both be committed to the ideas of, let's say, Nietzsche, as well as the ideas of, let's say, Kant. But I
mm,
can read both of them and, you know, come out with something useful for
yeah.
living. And so to come back to this question of how I relate to ideas, I do try to hold them lightly, but at the same time, I don't like dismissing ideas lightly either. I do have sometimes have a tendency, get angry at this person or that person or whatever. Just I'm completely human, but at the same time, I find it like I don't want to be lazy and just assume I can read a short summary of someone's work and then think, oh, I know all about this person. I would
Mm,
rather go in and adopt that worldview for a while. Often books
mm,
take a few weeks or months to read. And while I'm doing that, just see what the effects of it are. So I'm very interested in the kind of pragmatics of philosophy, or like, what is the effect of living on adopting a certain set of
mm,
ideas, and trying to hold it lightly so that I don't become too attached to it.
mm.
Does that answer it a
Yeah,
bit?
yeah, and that makes a lot of sense. So how are you implementing this process? Say you're reading your book and you're realizing like the principles in that book, and then are you consciously making decisions based on those same principles? Like how do you go about this process?
It's a great question. So I it depends a little on how I'm reading the book. Often I find
Mm,
that audiobooks, they kind of rattle around my head. I'm quite an auditory person, I think. And
mm,
so I listen to those, and because I'm sort of going through my daily business as I listen to the audiobook, then it kind of seeps into my life and the way that I think. When I'm
mm,
reading either a digital or a physical book, it's both important to me that I read it over a period of time, so I don't tend to rush through books. It's more likely that I'm reading 10 or 15 or 20 books at the same time. Some of them are
yeah.
like completely on the back burner, but I pick them up occasionally. And then Readwise has been quite transformative for me, which is
Mm,
just the ability to make highlights in digital books, or I can also add highlights from physical books. It's with OCR,
mm,
and then Readwise has a kind of spaced repetition system where things come back. And so I'm quite deliberate about, okay, what is this about that meta choice of like which books am I going to read? But then once I've
Mm,
chosen, then I try to live with those ideas as if they were true.
mm,
Which is not to say that I think that they're false, but more like in order to really understand another person's worldview, you kind of have to adopt more than you might expect in order to kind of say, what is the world like from this lens or something like
mm,
that.
mm. Yeah, that's a great answer. And so one of the things that I do believe in, and I want your take on it, is that so first of all, one of the things before that I really enjoy, and you mentioned about it, is like how can philosophy be practical?
Mm,
Because sometimes you talk with people that are either exploring philosophy or consider themselves philosophers, and usually the level of conversation is just pure abstraction, right?
mm,
And I'm fine with abstraction. I love it, abstract talking, but also if we're talking about philosophy, I do believe that we then want to understand how can that affect our life and our thinking, right, and our
mm,
understanding and our worldview. And so, personally, I do believe there are three things that somehow help us do this. The first one
mm.
is reading, as you
Yes.
mentioned, then writing, and to me, I believe that writing is deeply associated with thinking, right? And so I was wondering, like, if I was to say adopt your like, how is your own structure of reading and writing and thinking? Like, how do you go about that process of just picking a book? Do you take notes? Don't you take notes? Like, how guide me through the Brian Camp's process of thinking about a book.
So I do keep notes in Zotero about books that I hear about or read about, and I use this system called the Zettelkasten. I have written about it online if you're interested in reading about that kind of process. Have you heard of it before? Or
Yeah, 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 yeah.
yeah. So this is a kind of it's like the digital equivalent of just having a lot of index cards where you write sort of maybe quotes but also thoughts, and then they're very heavily interconnected. And so when I'm reading, I take pretty minimal notes and over a long period of time. And often these days I'm reading on Kindle. So I'm highlighting, I'm also adding notes in there, and then those are syncing up to Readwise.
Mm,
And then when they come back up in Readwise, then I create a Zettel for them, which is just like a file that has a short, they're supposed to be like atomic, so like one idea
mm,
on each card. And then I'm connecting that with other thinking I've done in the past. So that is the process of writing. And I really liked what you said about the act of writing as being very connected to thinking. So,
mm.
and I'm also curious, what was the third thing besides reading and writing
It
that you
was
had?
I had thinking there as
Oh,
well, like
thinking. Okay, yeah.
differentiated. But I do believe that thinking ends up being a byproduct of writing. So even though
Okay,
there are
yeah.
three, it's just a byproduct of them. One of
Yeah,
them.
yeah. So I definitely agree that those two are related. And I think of the Zettelkasten system. This is something from Sunka Arens, who wrote a book called How to Take Smart Notes, which is kind of a description of how one might implement this
Is that okay?
Zettelkasten note-taking system. And he talks about, what it is it's a process of thinking in writing so that you can come back to
Mm,
these thoughts. And I
mm,
I find that to be true. So I go back, even today I was looking at things, that I wrote maybe 1, 2, 3 years ago, and I think, oh, I know I've heard of this. In particular, it was Xenophanes of Colophon, who's like a 5th century BC Greek guy. And I was like, have I heard of this guy before? And actually, I've written a bunch of notes about him, and I'm like, oh, and I can just read those thoughts from maybe 1 or 2 years ago, and
mm.
it's almost like it takes you back in time to that place somehow.
Yeah.
And I've never had that with other forms of note taking. My whole life, from school onward, I would, just fill notebooks and everything like that. And yet I would never go back and reread them because I didn't have a way of kind of entering them somehow. I don't
Yeah.
know. Is this a problem you've had or?
Yeah, absolutely,
Mm,
absolutely. Like finding the idea of that guess, and specifically, I use Rome research to
mm,
do
mm,
it. Like having the capacity of creating these pages that then, when I'm thinking or when I'm writing, I can get back and realize, oh, a perfect example to prepare for this interview. When we met on the Intellect Salon, one of the first things that I did was basically create a Rome page with the name of everyone.
Ah, wow,
And
yeah.
and when we were having the discussion, and I was enjoying like your own thoughts and thinking about truth, I was taking notes in your page, and I was actually adding my own personal notes to what you were saying, or my own vision of who you were. And I told you before, like I was very impressed by how you guys were having like this very complex conversation. I had just fallen in there like with the parachute, trying to understand what was going on, and I was asking these questions that were very simple questions, but the way and the thoughtfulness that you used to take care of my and to answer my own question was something that impressed me, and I
Mm,
wrote that. And while getting ready for this interview, the first thing that I did was opening up Rome Research, opening up the page Bryan came, and let's see everything that I have here with
mm,
Bryan,
mm,
like the notes on your podcast, on your writing, on some of the videos that I watch, and was basically just picking the favorite questions, let's say, and just bring them to a page to ask you. So previously, before I didn't have Rome or Zoom, or Zettelkasten, and I had precisely the same problem with you, and sometimes I still have it, because I didn't tag something in Rome the way I should, or it has a different phrasing, but it's clearly better right now.
mm.
So I totally get what you're saying.
Yeah, so I think that describes my overall process. And I think the other aspect that I've been thinking about a lot lately is that I kind of think that the important ideas that come out of the history of thought, but also just like the ones that I'm working on, they tend to have this kind of balance between sort of order and chaos, I guess might be the simple way of saying it. But like, I've been kind of thinking about this health model of inquiry. So rather than thinking about truth as this kind of objective thing that we have different methods for just gradually unveiling, and
Hmm.
therefore we all see the same thing, I've been thinking more that that kind of there's a method of analysis that, as you were saying, can be very abstract within philosophy or mathematics or the sciences, and it can be quite maybe rigid and sort of rational. But then there's another sort of side to this equation which draws us back towards experience. And so rather than thinking that truth is a single sort of objective thing, that we have unique methods within science for unearthing or unveiling, and then we just find this object. It's more like there's a kind of pattern of going back and forth from abstract concepts and then back towards experience. So that kind of relates to what you were saying about, philosophy running the risk of becoming too abstract and then not relating to life again. And so, in my view, it's like I've been thinking about this kind of almost like zigzag pattern that's necessary. And I've been thinking about it in terms of like health. There are times when your body needs to sleep, but your body also needs to move, right? And these are not contradictory, right?
Yeah,
Both
complementary.
they're complementary and they're both important parts of health. And I've been thinking about this kind of health model of inquiry where if you get too abstract, then it's time to go back towards, experience and test this out and see how a life lived using that framework is. And then you can also go too far the other direction where you're not really doing enough synthesis of experience, or maybe you're not learning from
Mm,
experience, and you actually need to kind of go back towards the conceptual and think, okay, what have I learned? And
yeah.
so there's something that's an idea that I've been working with recently as a kind of overall framework for how I view the history of philosophy and the history of human thought, I guess.
Yeah, and it makes a lot of sense. And one of the things that you just mentioned, Ingrid, like I associate like my favorite people and my favorite thinkers are usually people that instead of using a lot of statements start by posing questions.
Mm,
Uh, And of course, any question will eventually lead itself to a statement or to an answer. I think, but like I do believe that the best people to actually talk about it and to learn from are people that are always posing or like posing questions. And
Mm.
so I guess that my question would be, what are some of your what are some of your favorite questions ever? And I think the second one would be like the follow up would be, what are some of the questions you're posing or asking yourself or the world right now?
That is a great question. And I too like philosophers who ask questions or just people who ask questions. It doesn't always need to be in philosophy. I kind of have a view that eventually I need to come out of philosophy and make this relevant to, people who are not so interested in philosophy because it might just be
Mm.
a weird kind of disease that you get at a certain point in your, or at least that I've gotten in my life in the last couple of years, that maybe the lockdown and things like that were like, oh, I'll seek refuge in philosophy. But if I
Mm.
stay there forever, then I'll feel like a bit alienated or something like
Mm.
that.
Mm.
And so the question of what questions I'm thinking about, I think the first driving one that I that organized a lot of my life and is still one that's central to what I'm thinking about today is, why do we suffer? And that's a question that I think relates to one of the other questions that I have, which is, how do complex things persist through time? On the face of it, they may not seem all that related, but I
Mhm.
kind of have a sort of evolutionary understanding of how ideas change, how people change. And I think that this question of existential suffering, so not just pain, which is, directly something goes wrong and it hurts, but this secondary level of sort of existential suffering or existential angst or something like that, which I had from a young age. And
Mhm.
that question was like, the question comes from a place of like, this can't be normal, which is like,
Mm.
why is life like this? And I think
Mm.
it's a hard question, of course, and not one that I can just give you an easy answer to. But at the same time, it's one that through sort of decades of like working on it and experimenting in different ways, I no longer feel that that question is life threatening, maybe, let's say. Like, it's now become like an interesting question for me, which is
Mm.
like, how has the modern condition of maybe some feelings of alienation or, loneliness
Mm.
or just not feeling kind of right for the environment, in a way that perhaps animals don't feel to, at least in the wild, don't feel to the same extent. They,
Yeah.
I certainly live around a lot of trees, and the trees don't have any. I don't get any vibes from them that they're not happy in their environment.
Yeah.
Whereas I can't speak for everyone. I'm sure there are many
Yeah.
people listening to this podcast who are much happier than I am. But I could say that many times in my life I've felt slightly out of place, or like I didn't quite fit my environment somehow. Do you know what I mean?
Mm. Mm. Yeah. And sorry, were you finishing?
No, so I guess yeah, one question, why do we suffer? And another question is, how does complexity arise and remain? Because it seems, yeah, I just have a bunch of questions within that philosophy thing. And because I see cultural formations, including states of mind, like not just our moods, but our ways of viewing the world as themselves almost lifelike organisms that kind of perpetuate themselves and live in their own environment.
Mm.
Like, how do these things relate to the kind of existential questions that we have? Like, did we always have these existential questions, or are they new? Would be like
Mm.
one of a central part of this question,
Mm. Yeah. So I just want to get back to ask you a more, I guess, personal question, and feel free to not answer. But like you mentioned that the question of why you suffer, it changed. It stopped being life threatening and started to be interesting. And I was wondering, like, what did prompt that change? Like, what? How, did you change? The question change? Was it some understanding of something itself that changed?
Yeah, I think probably I changed, and I think that the number one driver of that change was actually meditation. And
Mm,
that meditation has taken many forms. I started 5 or 6 years ago, and that kind of allowed me almost to like start the true investigation rather than being on a desperate search for relief as I was in
mm,
most of my 20s and like what is wrong with me? Why can't I be happy? Why does nothing seem to sort of sink in or the
yeah.
positive things? And I still have a fairly strong negativity bias, I would say. But with meditation came both the tool to investigate the question and actually relief from the suffering, I would say.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I do believe that meditation is a great way to do that. To, first of
Mm,
all, relieve your own suffering, which will then allow you to look at whatever was there in a more in a not so emotional way,
mm,
right? Instead of seeing those phenomena as something that are inherently bad or are causing suffering, if I'm relief of that suffering, I can look at it from a different lenses and actually understand, oh, okay, maybe it's because I did this or other people are this way and I have this worldview or there's this belief that's different, right? So yeah, I do believe that meditation is a great way. By the way, do you have like any kind of daily practice? How's your relationship with meditation?
So I do have a daily practice. I'm not incredibly rigid, as in, it's not like I do every single day of my life. I
Mm,
do most days, I would say.
mm,
There are sometimes when I'm too busy or, there's
yeah,
something going on, but I would say on a normal week, I would meditate every day.
yeah,
And
yeah.
so, and that's only sort of 15, 20 minutes. It varies a little bit. I've gone up to as much as like 45 and then kind of
Mm,
scaled it back down to 10 and then
mm,
try sort of found that about 20 minutes is like a good level for me.
yeah.
And what the actual practice is changes over time. But right
Okay.
now I'm doing a form of Buddhist meditation, which is kind of analytical on this concept called dependent origination or dependent
Mm,
co-arising, which is a quite seems very abstract. It is a difficult sort of to summarize easily. But if people are interested, there's an excellent book on this topic by a guy named Lee Brasington, and that book is called Dependent Origination and Emptiness.
mm.
I would be happy to explain it, but it is, I just warn
Oh
people,
yeah,
it
yeah,
is
yeah,
like
yeah,
a quite involved topic.
yeah. I don't know. We can leave the link in the description,
Yeah.
and people will check the book.
And can I ask
Um,
you, do you have
yeah.
a meditation practice or?
Yeah, it changes over time. So
Mm,
I'm not as a committed meditator as you. Like sometimes I do have like these streaks where I'm meditating every day.
mm,
Other times I'm not, but I do try to have at least one activity a day where I'm fully present, regardless
yes.
of it being meditation or not. So one of the things that I do rather often is when I feel that I'm in the need of just having a little bit of space, like creating space in and free space in my mind. One of the things that I'll do is I'll just pick up the guitar and start
Mm,
improvising because I was a jazz musician before having a wrist injury, and so I've developed this relationship with the guitar where I can basically just turn down my brain and my analytical mind and the inner dialogue and just
wow.
replace it with notes and sounds and musical ideas. And so I would say that I do that rather often when I'm not meditating. Or another
Mm,
thing that I'll do is I'll go run, and sometimes I will do it without any kind of music, just going on a run. And I do find like the practical benefits of meditation usually are similar to those
mm,
of running without music or just playing the guitar without playing a
mm,
specific
mm.
song or anything else. Um, yeah.
Yeah, and this relates actually to what we were just talking about in terms of the question of whether you go more towards abstraction or more towards experience. Because I
Mm,
totally agree that exercise, running, I also lift weights, and I
yeah.
find a similar kind of benefit from that. And I would say that in my early life, I was searching for answers, like why, like
Mm,
it feels like something's wrong. There must be like an intellectual answer.
mm,
And I did a lot of searching, which I don't regret in any way, but I think it wasn't until I started, especially meditation, I started exercising relatively frequently, maybe about a little bit before I started meditating, maybe 3 or 4 years before. And you could say that those are the equivalent of a return to experience, right? And that's what I've
mm,
actually found is that if we remain in the, or at least I'll just speak from my experience, if I remain in the realm of abstract ideas, I can often make a sort of psychodrama about just about anything, like, oh, this
mm,
person thinks this, blah, 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 blah.
mm,
And, that I can generate this massive story that's very dramatic and has all these problems. And then if I keep trying to analyze, then it tends to make that story grow. Whereas
mm,
if I think of in a, it's still analytical, but it's more directed at experience. It's like, okay, how do I feel right now, and what's really going on here in this moment at the experiential level, rather
mm,
than remaining in this realm of concepts. And so,
mm,
what the interesting thing that I've learned on the individual level, and this is like a live thought, I haven't actually said this before or necessarily even thought this before, which is that the it's almost like the meditation where I pay really close attention to experience is what allows the conceptual layer to change. Whereas if I
mm,
operate at the conceptual layer, it tends to like reinforce it. And what I'm
mm,
starting to wonder about is like, if that's also true, let's say at the level of scientific revolutions, which is that the
mm,
things that tend to disrupt a working scientific paradigm are not actually intellectual arguments against that paradigm, but rather new experimental results
yeah.
or something like that.
Yeah, there's this great quote, and I forget from who it is, but it's something, and I'll butcher it probably, but it's something along the lines of you can, the only way to create a new, the only way to create change is to bring a new paradigm that makes the old
Mm.
one look obsolete.
Mm.
And so, and by just pointing out problems in the current paradigm and or questions to the current paradigm, you can never bring that kind of revolution, right? Because you need something
Mm.
that comes, as you were saying, and we'll go full circle to the beginning of the conversation. We there's the only way to actually create something that's not in that can cause a revolution is to basically let it. It has to emerge from outside of the current system because if it is within the current system, it probably won't be a new paradigm, right?
Mm.
Um, and not only, yeah, go ahead. Sorry.
No, I was just thinking as you were saying that this probably relates to this question of golden ages, right? Which is that it might not be obvious that sort of local community efforts could have a big societal change, but on this model, it's almost like the granularity and the care and attention taken at the level of experience can
Mm,
affect your lifetime narrative. And the specific experiments that you're running as a scientist could affect, could eventually provoke a scientific revolution. So just within the framework of golden ages, it might be that you have to start sort of in your own life or in your own relationships, let's say,
yeah,
in order
yeah.
to start catalyzing bigger changes. You know what I mean?
Yeah, absolutely. And so, and that's a perfect segue to the topic. And I'll comment on that because I after doing like the podcast. So just some history and on the podcast itself. I decided I wanted to do the podcast after seeing Visa's meme on the Domino's meme that ended up as golden age of humanity. And I look at
Mm,
it and I realize, oh, I want to be part of this. And my uh, thinking back then was, okay, I don't think I can figure out this problem out of my just out of on my own. I
mm,
do
mm,
need to, but because I don't have that intellectual power. So what I can do though is basically do things that I enjoy, which is basically talk to people and actually asking questions and try to understand like what does a modern golden age look like. And I call it modern because there are some principles that I do believe will be present that will make it different from all the previous modern of all the previous golden ages. But I did end up following. Wait, I ended up being too abstract about it and just forgetting about the experience. And so it took me a long time to actually start the podcast because I had this idea in my mind of if I want to be the host of a podcast called Modern Golden Age, I'll
Mm.
have to have all the principles that I learned from until then I realized that that made no sense. What I had to do is to basically talk with a lot of different because who am I to say what a modern golden age looks like, right? I'm
Mm.
an
Mm.
individual, and if we're going to get there, there has to be a co-creation. It can't be
Yes.
just one people just saying, well, this is the vision, let's go. It has to be a co-creation. So once I figured that out, I realized, well, I'm going to talk with a lot of people
Mm.
and try to understand what are the common principles among all of them. And then I can pick those up and share and say, look, I've talked with 100 people about golden ages, and these are the things that almost everyone, if not everyone, mentioned.
Mm.
And maybe those can serve as guiding principles for everyone to build like this vision. And so the question that I usually ask every guest, and I will ask you right now, is what does a modern golden age looks like to you?
It's a great question. And I think for me, the key feature is something to do with flourishing and flourishing in groups. So small committed groups that are kind of working towards common goals, but they also, they each have their own individual ways of manifesting that energy. And it's a kind of mutually supportive environment. So there's like encouragement. There's not a sense of, if there is a sense of competition, it's not a kind of zero sum
Mm,
thinking. It might be that you and I are both inspired to make even better podcasts because I listen to yours and I think it's great, and vice versa, and so
hmm
we do it in that way, but not with the understanding that I'll somehow outcompete you, or that
Yeah,
my podcast will make yours irrelevant or something like
yeah,
that, but rather that by both striving towards excellence, maybe in very different ways, that will inspire each other and be able to encourage each other.
mm,
And at least for me, there's a strong embodied element of it, or at least that's what I'm feeling at the moment. Maybe just after a lot of Zoom and everything, I have massively benefited from communities like the Interintellect and the salons and meeting people like you through these ways. But I think it's also quite important for us to sort of come together. And so there is an element of that. It seems like it's kind of happening in many different ways in, well, at least you see sort of on Twitter, lots of kind of gatherings and things like that. And even with the II, I'm lucky to be in London, and we organize gatherings, and so I think, yeah, I suppose that's my initial response. Does
yeah,
that
yeah. And
resonate?
it makes absolutely. So
Mm.
one of the things that I do believe, and I call it modern golden age because I believe that technology allows for something that otherwise, and so far it was impossible in terms of golden
Yes.
ages, which is basically we're no longer bounded by geography.
Right.
And so, even though it's very, very important to build these communities and to have these gatherings, as you were mentioning, the beginning of it may be online.
Yes.
So, and that's why I call it modern, because I do believe what's going to happen is we're going to have a bunch of different groups, a bunch of different individuals meeting online,
Mm.
creating these communities, and then it will leak out into the real world,
Mm. Mm. Mm.
right? And so the community aspect of it is fundamental because and I do believe that a part of us get to modern golden age is like the first brick, let's say, to get there. I'm starting to believe that is helping people to live purpose-led lives
Mm,
that will then allow them to build purpose-led projects and
mm,
purpose-led businesses and purpose-led governments even. And in that, when you have that kind of space, because if you're living a purpose-led life, you inevitably you will meet other people that are doing the same, and together you can actually co-create and pursue different ideas, as you were mentioning, like the whole inter-intellect
yes.
space is one of them, like the whole teapot community on Twitter is another. And so
Mm,
doing those things is what will then allow us to understand what's the next step to get to a modern golden age. Because once again, I don't know what it looks like, but I'm starting to believe that this is like the process of building these communities by helping people live purpose-led lives is probably one of the first steps for us to get there. So the whole community aspect of it makes little sense, and in a sense, and I would love to hear your comments on what I just said. But in a sense, I do believe that that's why I started the podcast.
mm,
That because I believe that right now, geographically, even though Lisbon is starting to get more and more people, and I'm really excited about that, uh, it would be hard to get those gatherings, right? And having the podcast has allowed me to connect with people and start building relationships that will then turn into friendships. Um, through just the online meeting, and the major goal is always like building a relationship online, transforming it to a friendship, and then getting it offline, right, leaking
mm,
into reality. And so that's my view on what you just said about the importance of the community.
mm.
But go ahead, I would love to hear your thoughts on this.
Well, yeah, first, I love that you start with the purpose led life because I do think that it's about living rather than abstract ideas. It's important to put the emphasis on action, experimentation, trying things out, trying social experiments to see what works. Because
Yes.
to me, if you kind of try to do too much in the abstract realm of ideas, it's not that you shouldn't have ideas and test them out, but more like if you do too much of engineering at the start, then and you never get around to the actually living the purpose led life, then
Yeah.
it kind of just remains a nice idea rather than something that has practical consequences.
Yeah.
And the other thing that brought to mind is just that what you were saying about inviting people onto a podcast to build that community and to think together with you. I think that that may be the primary and original way of thinking that, we
Yeah.
oral culture long predates writing. It's not really
Yeah.
known how long we've been speaking for, but it's at least tens of thousands, probably hundreds of thousands, maybe millions of years, right? So it's really, really a long time. And writing is maybe 4,000, 5,000 years old. I'm probably getting this wrong and someone will correct me, but like that's the order of magnitude at least. Let's say,
Mm.
you know, speaking is maybe 100 times older than writing is. And
Yeah.
so it's just something that I've been a kind of idea that I've been exposed to and thinking about, which is that what if thinking doesn't begin in a single mind? What if it begins in speech? And so, it's dialogical from the start, in the same way that we can kind of have little conversations with ourselves inside our head, but maybe that's not the original way of thinking at all. And that's actually a kind
Mm.
of downstream effect of having conversations over a very long period. And so I think your approach is in my view, it just very much aligns with the way that I'm thinking about how thinking arises in the first place.
Yeah. That makes a lot of sense. I had never thought about that, and that makes a lot of sense. And because the way I'm thinking about it is, and as you also said, like this is, I never thought about this, so it has no filters. But I'm thinking about how maybe the original thought comes from conversation, and then
Mm,
writing allows you to clarify your individual version of that thought that emerged out of the community,
mm,
right?
mm, mm. Yes.
And that making like a relationship, because that was the first thing that popped out in my mind when you were talking about. I see that has a jazz group, and I
Mm,
do have a tendency to compare a lot of things with jazz, but it taught me so much. And what usually happens when you're playing a jazz game is that there's a moment where what happens is you're improvising, right? Jazz lives
Mm-hmm.
out of improvisation, and so uh, like from an outside perspective, it may look like what's happening is, let's say you have like a saxophone, piano, double bass, and the drums, and it may look like if the saxophone is soloing, it may look like everyone else is just building a bed so the soloist can play above them. But the truth is, if you play jazz for a while, you'll understand that what is happening, you're co-creating something. Like
Mm,
everything is influencing each other, right? If the musicians know each other and are actually connecting, what is happening is it's always a constant co-creation. And
right.
even though someone is soloing, meaning he's the one that's somehow getting more
Leading a bit,
attention,
or
yeah, leading a bit, the reality is that everyone else is influencing everyone else, right? That's what the great jazz musicians do. And maybe in conversation, in thinking, the same thing happens. If we gather a group, maybe let's say we have like 5, 6 different people, and someone poses a question, meaning he or she is the soloist, he's setting up an intention or a direction, but then what happens is, as we are talking, everyone else is thinking about what the other people are contributing and are saying, and like the collective thought arises from there until we get an idea that can then be digested by writing, by thinking, by reading about the aspect and clarifying or crystallizing your own thought. But the origin of it was actually on the group, and that makes a lot of sense. I really enjoy that idea.
yeah, I
Yeah.
love what you've just said about this co-creation. And I also agree that writing is super important in this equation, certainly in today's, the past past few thousand years, let's say, in the sense that you have this kind of energetic oral culture, and then if it's transmitted at the right moment or captured at the right moment, you can have something really incredible. And you could
Mm-hmm.
say, Homer would be an example of this, the Odyssey
Mm,
and the Iliad. You
yeah.
could say that parts of the Bible, which are kind of come from this much older tradition, but then they get transmitted down, and even more modern thinkers who have sort of circles, or circles, or when we think of the Bloomsbury set or something like that, they have these. On the one hand, they're meeting up in person. On the other hand, the reason we care about them is because they transmit something in writing. And so I think there's a kind of balancing act. At the beginning, I was talking about this issue of sort of order and chaos, and this balance of it sort of leads to complexity or something lifelike.
Mm,
And to me, the oral culture can iterate very quickly, right? So if you and I, let's say we're meeting up with a group of friends, we'll develop in jokes and all kinds of things like very quickly. But if we never write that down, then it's not like a very durable form of
mm,
cultural
mm,
contribution,
yeah,
right?
yeah.
And so there's a kind of balance between these two, because if you start writing too early, you aren't going to get something very interesting. And if
Mm-hmm.
you sort of don't write anything down, you might get very rapid, cultural evolution, but you won't get something that is durable through time. So
Yeah.
this kind of relates to what I was saying earlier about my questions about how do things persist through time. And one answer is that they've got to be kind of this right balance of evolution, so like change, and some kind of grounding in terms of writing or setting something down, or
Mm,
or it could be recording a podcast, or it could
yeah.
be making a video or something, because those are forms that are durable, right? Like we're
Yeah.
taking this, and if we don't record it, it's a nice conversation. If we do record it, it actually has a different effect, right? It kind of
Yeah.
captures something that's right now living, but by the
Mm-hmm.
time anyone else hears it, it will be static,
Mm-hmm.
right? It will have
Yeah.
happened in the past, right?
Yeah. And I think that like writing or recording something, making it uh, grounded is a way of creating a block that can be then worked with, right? You're
Mm,
creating a piece that you can then use in the future to actually build something around it. Like if we're having, as you're saying, if we had this conversation and we weren't recording it, it would affect both of us
Yes.
and directly and could then affect like in an indirect way people around us, right? Because I'm
Mm.
having this conversation, I'm loving what you're saying, and I'm thinking, oh, maybe I have some friends that are actually interested in those things, let me talk with them.
Mm,
So
mm.
that can happen, but by recording the conversation, there's people that can in the future listen to it and understand, oh, this can be a founding block on my own thinking, and start to think and apply the ideas, or think about the ideas and principles that we're laying out here into their own lives in a way that it wouldn't be possible if they hadn't at least a direct access to our conversation, right?
Yes.
And so that makes a lot of sense.
One thing I
Yeah, go
wanted to
ahead.
say is this is maybe just a bugbear of mine, like something that I always think about, which is this issue of going back to original sources. And so, what you were saying about creating a block or creating something durable between us, and then people can kind of refer to that, right? And
Yeah.
one thing that, earlier you're asking about my sort of writing and thinking practice, and I wasn't always attuned to this, but now I try as often as I can when almost anyone I respect says something or writes something that I'm like, wow, this is really cool. If they mention something else, let's say they put a quote in there, I'll go back to that original source, read the quote and the context, and often then this leads back and back, and this is why you so often, at least in the West, end up back in Greek philosophy because
Yeah.
so much of it comes from there.
Stems from that. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. But there's something about that issue of like returning to the same places. And so, if you have these thinkers, whether they're, modern thinkers or, even from a few hundred years ago, and you're thinking, okay, well, what's influencing them?
Mm.
And there is a sense in which that's sort of what philosophy is. It's this very long running dialogue or conversation
Mm.
about people commenting on some of the same ideas over very long periods of time. But that's kind of a side note just to say that like I really like this idea of making these, not just making the durable blocks, but also kind of taking the pilgrimage to these
Mm.
earlier uh, you know sort of blocks or keystones of earlier movements and say like what was going on for these guys if
Yeah.
they're all referring to Goethe or whatever, maybe I should read Goethe, like something like that.
Yeah.
I don't know if that resonates at all.
Yeah, yeah, and it makes a lot of sense, and it's like it's something that I only recently started to do, like going through a book and really enjoying the book, and then going to the bibliography and trying to understand,
Mm,
oh, okay, so he mentions this book. Well, let me read that book, and
mm,
then that will often lead to another, and all these experiences, which is something that I think it happens not only in literature or thinking or even philosophy, but in general. Because if you listen to any record, any music,
mm.
will that like the composer, the band, the artist, whatever you want, they'll have influences. And if you do
Yes.
a little digging, you'll understand, oh, maybe the influence is this record. Oh, and I'm going to listen to that record and listen, oh, funny. I kind of hear what he's saying, what he's playing here, and let's go here. And I do believe that progress then happens when, once again, someone starts to, and I'm just thinking about this right now, but maybe progress happens when
Mm.
someone goes through these different rabbit holes in a way that maybe other people haven't gone yet, and comes up after doing that all that journey, it comes up with a new way of looking at things, or a new way of playing, or a new way of organizing a specific set of elements, right?
Mm.
And then can cause a revolution by mixing all these different elements in a way that it hadn't happened before, right?
Right.
Or doing that, or sorry, or maybe discovering something where other people just didn't found anything.
Yes.
But I don't know what.
I love that. What it's making me think of is in Borges, Jorge Luis Borges. We read this collection of his labyrinths from the early '60s, I think, and he's got this one called Kafka and his precursors, And he
Mm.
makes this argument that there's all these authors that if you just read them independently, they have nothing in common, but each of them is Kafka-esque, even though they're writing before
Mm.
Kafka. And he's like, it's only after the birth of Kafka that they become, or after the writing of
Mm.
Kafka that you've read it, that they
And you see
come
them
to
all
seem
together.
to have something in
Mm.
common. And what they have
Yeah,
in common is something that they could never have known because it's a person that isn't born until after
yeah.
all their
After.
writing is done and after they've all died. And so there might be a similar thing in music, which is that any good musician, of course, you don't create music in a vacuum, as you were saying, right?
Yeah,
You have these influences,
yeah.
but there might be a similar way that a good musician creates his own influences or creates his own uh, or her own precursors
Mm.
by mixing all of these, earlier works of genius into
Mm.
something utterly new and
Yeah.
contribute something, himself or herself to that thing. But and then after that sort of new work comes out, the old works come to seem related, even though they weren't.
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
that makes a lot of sense, and it takes me to something that I do believe it's related to golden ages and to a modern golden age, which is intellectual or artistic humility. And what I mean by this is that the only way for you to actually look to do this and to see all these different authors or all these different writers or all these different musicians and then create something around it is if you're willing to actually explore their work regardless of how they relate to your current field. What I mean by this is that that like there are so many great musicians that
Mm,
ended up creating something really new because like the one example stood out like if you take Charlie Parker, which is one of the best jazz saxophonists ever. The whole movie about Whiplash is about him, or actually it's not about him, but it's like the structure. It's his own story, like the
mm,
constant pursuit of greatness through him. But like Parker, what he did was basically he had a lot of influence on jazz, which was his field, but he also was exploring things that were not related to jazz at all. So
mm,
in a moment in time where jazz was basically a byproduct of black culture and classical music or erudite music was basically a product of white culture, Charlie Parker used to carry like the lead sheets from Stravinsky's The Rite of Spring, which is
mm.
something that's
Wow.
very far from jazz, you know.
Yes.
But what he would do, he would
It's
look at the
quite a
different
radical piece, isn't
harmonies,
it? Yeah.
absolutely. And so
Mm,
what he did was he would look at all these different harmonies and ways Stravinsky was using rhythm, and then he would bring that to his solos, and he would bring that to his compositions, right? And so apparently Stravinsky would be like on the far end of what you think when you think
mm.
about Charlie Parker, and yet its influence, if you start to actually analyze and know this, you'll see them clearly. So I do believe that you need to bring this humility into your own creation, into your own craft, where you're willing to explore places that don't seem like the usual places to go or but can actually teach you a lot, right?
Mm, mm.
And I do believe that's a principle to create something that's worthwhile in modern golden age, right? To come up with these different ideas.
Yeah, I love that. And this idea of having very wide influences. It reminds me of, for some reason, something that I was doing a few years ago. I was translating French poetry, even though I don't really speak French. I don't speak French, but I, studied Latin and I studied Spanish, and then I kind of started, just on Duolingo or whatever French. And I had this idea. Well, basically, what it reminds me of is Stefan Zweig, the Austrian author, writing sort of like I think he's growing up in the late 19th century, and he dies, commits suicide during the Second World War.
Mm.
And he wrote a memoir called, now I'm going to forget, The World of Yesterday. And in that memoir, he has other like young writers coming to him and asking him for advice about what to do, what to write about. And his advice was not to tell them what to write, but just to say, if you don't know what to write, you should translate. And the reason that you
Mm,
should translate is because there's no way to get closer to a great writer than to actually go word by word, and actually try to render the exact
mm,
effect of that writing. It's like the most intense form of like meditative
mm,
practice on a piece of writing is how do I
yeah.
actually bring this to life in the same way in the new language. And so or sort of in my native language or the destination language, whatever it's called, from my understanding of what exactly is going on in the original language. And so I ended up translating this poem called Le Bateau Ivre, or the Drunken Ship, by Arthur Rimbaud, a French poet from the 1870s. And it's just making me think of that, like, that practice basically of kind of, in that case, actually selecting your own influences, or at
Mm-hmm,
least saying who's someone I admire. And I was
mm-hmm,
wondering if there's like a kind of equivalent in music. I suppose doing a musical cover might be something like that, where you
mm-hmm.
say, okay, I'm going to devote all this time to like take this song that I really love and make it my own, but still have this, connection to the original that,
Yeah.
I don't know. It
Yeah.
was just something that I
No,
was
but
thinking
there
of.
is. It's so funny. It's perfect. So when you're starting to learn how to improvise in jazz, one
Mm,
of the things that any great teacher will tell you is the one thing that you need to do. Forget about studying scales and studying chords. The one thing that you need to do is to transcribe your favorite solos.
wow.
So what will happen is you're listening to a record and you listen to a solo that you really enjoy. And so what you'll have to do is you go back to that record and you actually learn how to play the solo note by note.
Wow.
And then after doing that, you're starting to incorporate the feeling and you're starting to realize, oh, so that's how it feels to play this way, right?
Wow.
And it's
Yes.
not only
It's embodied.
yeah, yeah, precisely. That's the word, right?
Yeah.
And so what will then happen is after you're doing that, there's two things that may happen. The first one is you forget about the solo, but the embodiment part stays there. And sometimes you're
Mm,
improvising and suddenly a whole sentence of that solo comes out of you,
right.
right? So that will happen. Or the second one is after you transcribe that solo, pick them up and understand like uh, analyze the solo and understand your favorite passages of the whole solo, like what's going on there, like what musically speaking, what kind of notes is he
Mm,
playing, what kind of scale is he thinking, and then improvise on that scale whatever you want. But like you're basically trying to understand what are the principles that are guiding someone you admire, right, and then implement them on their own. And so that the idea of translating something,
yes.
it's a direct parallel with this,
This
and it
is
makes a lot of sense.
this is amazing because it's like training the intuition, right? It's
Yeah.
basically, I had no idea that jazz musicians do that. Although I read David Epstein's Range, and he has this kind
Mm,
of section where he contrasts the practice of classical music, where you're kind of trying to get every note perfect,
yeah.
and yet if you get, it's almost like if you get incredibly good at classical music, it makes it even hard. It makes it hard to improvise, and so it's like almost like
Absolutely.
a an opposite skill. And what I'm just thinking now is like, what if it is like a sort of left hemisphere, right hemisphere kind of
Yeah.
split, and the way that you sort of train the train each hemisphere, even though they both require practice, it's like very different forms of
Mm.
practice. I don't
Yeah,
know.
and yeah, it's like if you ever go to a music college, and where you have both jazz and classical,
Mm,
you'll see that there's a Venn diagram, right?
mm,
There's people in the middle, which are usually not that many, that really enjoy both genres and want to learn from each other.
right.
But then you'll have like the whole opposite sides where I'm a classical musician. I don't even understand why would someone want to improvise. My focus is going to be playing this set of notes in the perfect way. And you'll
Yes.
have like other jazz musicians who would go, I don't understand classical music. You have no freedom. Why would someone would want to improve their technique to a point where they can are playing every single note in the very detailed way? So it is sometimes it is like this very different approach to music. I do believe that the people that I admire the most, both
Yes.
composers, musicians, and even friends when I was studying and playing, are people that are willing to learn from both sides. Are people
Mm.
that are trying to improvise with the level, with the like bringing the quality of, because musical classical music is like you have a sheet music and you need to understand that each single note has a certain way to be played. And that's why you
Yes.
have like the conductor, right? It's someone who understands the piece and who's telling you to a very granular level what you need to do in order to bring the whole piece together. And like jazz musicians are not that way. Sometimes you listen to a jazz solo and like the some of the biggest jazz musicians are playing some notes where the quality of the playing is not that good. You know,
Mm,
sometimes
mm,
it's
mm.
just you hear these floppy notes or whatever. And I do believe that the best musicians are the ones who are trying to improvise, of course, but bringing like the quality and dedication to each note that the classical musicians bring.
Can I ask a
Um,
question?
yeah.
Would you consider classical composers more as, are they more similar to classical musicians or jazz musicians? Or do you think there's not a general answer
Hmm.
to that question? Because I'm just thinking, like on the one hand, you've got classical and they're these kind of fixed pieces and you're trying to learn to play them perfectly. But then on the other hand, you've got this improvisation. And so I'm wondering, in terms of the composition of those classical pieces, was that at the time more on the improvisational side? And
Yeah.
then it only becomes classical by virtue of its age? Or is there something that was already classical about it?
Yeah, it depends on the composer.
Okay.
So, for instance, Bach was known by improvising a lot and
Mm,
just then trying to write some of his favorite improvisations.
mm,
So I do I'm can't remember the source. I think it was one of my teachers. Because when I went to college, I did like I was studying jazz, but I did like optative subjects in classical music because I wanted
mm,
to understand specifically composing. Like one of them told me that some of his sonatas are actually cello suites, for instance, are actually some improvisations that he used to do on the harpsichord, and then he wrote them. But once again, it varies from different composer to composer because there are a lot
mm.
of composers that write things that they cannot play.
Right.
And
Okay.
so, and
Interesting.
so you have like, and sometimes when we think about it, we think about a composer being a musician as well, and sometimes that's not the case. Sometimes you have someone whose craft is writing music, not play it, right?
Yes.
And and so but then there are people that can do both, and they'll have different approaches. Some people will improvise and try to understand like how can I really enjoy this chord progression. How can I build like a melody around it? But other people will be very technical about it,
Mm,
and they'll follow these different structures and try to bring these different chords. And that's why for some people, if you listen to a bunch of different composers in the same era, let's call it that, there are a lot of people who say that they'll sound the same because the structure they're following is indeed the same, and the chord progression will not be the same, but will be
mm,
fairly similar, right?
mm.
But that's the same, I guess, with writing or with any other
Yeah.
art. There's this movement.
Yeah, I'm thinking about writing because so my background's in literature, as in I studied 18th and 19th century literature as an undergraduate and as a graduate. And I am also, if I am anything, I am a writer, I think. I do write every day. And when you're speaking about that issue of composers composing things that they can't play versus people who might be improvising and then trying to write down from that,
Mm,
improvised inspiration. It made me wonder about, writers who are primarily writing things that they could never say in speech, whereas other writers might be actually writing more or less how they speak, that it's more
mm,
sort of conversational. And I personally, when I'm writing, especially by hand, I almost don't edit at all. Like it kind of just comes out as it, like it's formed I would say like on the more improvisational side. Of course, when I
Mm.
go, if I do a blog post or a longer piece or something, then of course it involves editing.
Yeah.
But it's an interesting question, just like if there's also this split between kind of like classicism in writing, which might be more structured and is something that actually couldn't be said because it's kind of inherently written or something like
Mm.
that. Whereas
Mm.
there's another mode of writing that's more oral. So
Yeah.
even though they both end up as, text on a page, they're
Yeah.
actually somehow different.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. And so, just going back a little, one of the things that I mentioned was this idea of intellectual humility as something that's important to understand, like your influences and be willing to explore outside of your current realm.
Hmm.
I would love to hear what are some of like I consider that a practice. That's something you can practice, right? I would love to listen to what are some other practices that you believe we need to do in order to bring a modern golden age.
Hmm. So it might sound a little cliche, but listening is one of the major ones. I think learning to listen well is really important and not just be kind of waiting to speak, but actually trying to connect, maybe even trying to summarize or reflect back to the other person. That's a practice that one of my friends does, and I wish I did it more often and better. It's something that I'm kind of working on. And then with that listening comes encouragement, which I think is a word I might have already said, which is
Mm-hmm.
just this in the early stages. Actually, this is something that came up for me yesterday. There's an idea from David Krakauer at the Santa Fe Institute, and it's this idea of the mountain monastery metropolis. And so basically, the
Mm.
idea is that in the course of your development, or let's say in the course of writing a piece of music or writing a book or something like that, there's going to necessarily be a period where you're kind of on your own. You've got to go and get the kind of inspiration, influences, all that kind of stuff, and you're essentially you're at the top of the mountain all on your own. Then you
Yeah.
come down into a kind of intellectual monastery, which is a community of supportive individuals where basically whatever you're doing, it's pretty much just pure support. And it's not because criticism is not like criticism is definitely needed in order to improve, right?
Mm.
But criticism that's too early can discourage you, and or at least it can certainly discourage me. And so the idea here is just that, there's a really important, as we were talking about small communities, of encouragement and almost like unconditional love, to put it in extreme terms, before you can go out into the metropolis where it's actually seen by the public. And if it's anything of any worth, it's not only going to be, loved by some people, it's probably also going to be attacked by some people,
Yeah.
And so, but by that time, it will have become its own almost like living thing in the sense that
Mm.
it can defend itself. Whereas
Mm.
maybe when you're at this stage of the monastery, you need to protect it a bit, foster it, nurture it, nourish it, all that kind of
Mm.
stuff, and to allow that initial flourishing. It's like very easy to kill, a young plant, let's say, or something like
Yeah.
that. But once it's, this big anti-fragile thing that's been through several, seasons or whatever, then you're less concerned about, oh, is it going to die if I don't water it at the exact right hour or something like that.
Yeah.
And I suppose those things in my mind are all related. It's like, this ability to come together in a community, to listen to one another, and to give pretty much unconditional encouragement.
Mm.
Those are skills that probably have to be learned. And I've
Mm.
experienced how hard it can be when that's not a norm within a community and someone is, kind of attacking an idea too early on.
Mm.
And it can be quite painful, it can really shut things down in that environment. And that's not
Yeah.
to say that we all just need to be constantly, loving everything that everyone's doing and,
Yeah.
we can't criticize anything. But I think there's a time and place for criticism. And maybe
Mm.
in terms of developing a golden age, there is this place where, the nascent ideas everything's good and we're going to encourage all of them and see which ones stick and which ones we can amplify.
Mm.
And rather than, I think maybe within modern society, social media, whatever, there can be a tendency to just attack things, and that can be really crippling to certain kinds of
Yeah.
projects.
Yeah, and ideas. So, following that idea, like there's in the monastery, you'll have like this unconditional encouragement. Is
Yes.
there a moment where that encouragement takes a form of actually thoughtful feedback or criticism, or the criticism only happens in the metropolis phase?
It probably happens in the monastery. It's a good point because once let's say you and I are working on something together, whether it's a piece of
Mm,
music or writing or whatever, during that period of unconditional encouragement, we will build up a kind of trust
mm,
where, I know that our interests are aligned. We both care about what we're working on.
mm,
And therefore, I can take your, like, even very harsh criticism where you say,
mm-hmm,
okay, we both know that this is all great, but this part, there's all these problems, and you can be very honest.
mm-hmm.
And that will be, and also we will know each other quite well by
Yeah,
that point,
yeah,
so that we'll be able to
yeah,
calibrate, like, and I'll know, you know, okay,
yeah.
one could be that I would know that you're very sensitive to criticism. I personally am quite quite sensitive to criticism,
Mm,
and so then I can word it in such a way that you get the message without it being like
without,
hurtful or discouraging.
yeah, yeah.
Within other collaborations, I've had it other ways where people are like, no, you need to be really blunt. If this is not good, like just tell
Mm,
me it's crap, or something
mm,
like that.
mm.
And that could be another emergent thing that comes within the monastery, as you're saying, but as a secondary point to the
Yeah,
to the
after building
yes, yeah,
the trust in relationships. So that will lead me to another question, which is what, besides what you just mentioned, like the ability to do deep listening and to provide and to understand, like to be able to construct a relationship where it's rooted in trust and love, and being able to be flexible enough to adjust the way you communicate something to then one day, if needed, criticize their work. Because I'm just like, yeah. So besides all that, what are some of the aspects that you want to see in people that you're bringing to your own monastery? Because I do believe, like this whole, from all those different phases, I believe that a modern golden age will be directly related to the monastery phase, where basically you're coming down from a mountain and you're having a group of people. Because if I want criticism, I want criticism not from the metropolis, because
yes,
that will either distract me or I'll ignore it completely, because oh,
yes,
they don't understand, they don't know, and maybe there are some valuable criticism there, but I will shut it down because I feel like I'm being attacked. But on a monastery, on the other hand, I want people that are actually very supportive, but
mm,
also can somehow point out the things that the flaws in my reasoning, or in my thinking, or in my music, right? So I would ask, like, what kind of individuals would you like to have on your own monastery?
it's a great question. I would like to have people who are also very motivated to contribute and like have their own ideas, but that they can sort of support other things as well. So, in other words, that the my ideal would be kind of like emergent, temporary collaborations. So like it's like, oh, I'm working on this piece of music. What do you think? And then you come in and you're like, oh yeah,
Mm,
and you add to that. But it's not just like only coming to me. That we might both do that for someone else or something like
mm,
that. And what I've found in the communities that I've sort of started, because I've been lucky to be a part of the Interintellect and other communities, but there's also some that I've started in London and
mm,
either started or inherited, as it were, as in someone else started it and then handed it over to me, including a book club and a discussion group. And what I find is that some of it becomes self-selecting once the monastery is underway, but a very good way to sort of to get that self-selection process going is to require some kind of contribution up front. So
mm,
we've almost never had any issues I think I can say that we've never had any issues at my book club or at my discussion group. And I kind of wonder if it's not because they require, you know, reading and effort in order to get involved in them. And so there's this understanding that you're coming in order to contribute to a conversation. And often we're all coming to something new. So it's not necessarily, there are times that when we would love to have, you know, an expert along or something like that. But in general, we're all going into the new territory together. And so there's something already collaborative about that. And so I don't know if that's a general principle, but it's something that I've thought about a little bit. And, you know, interintellect salons have this a bit too, which is that there's, you know, a reading list and there's an understanding that you're coming to participate in a discussion. So maybe some element of like, almost, it's not like, you know, you could also limit attendance by just charging money or something like that.
Yeah.
But I think that would be a very different effect, you know, which is just like if you have a free event, but you have to read this, you know, 20-page thing or something to attend, it just ends up selecting a different kind of person. And I'm not saying that's the only kind of person that you'll ever want to have, but at least that's been my experience that it does, you know, contribution up front both makes people more interested, involved, committed, collaborative, and it sort of limits people that might come in with a more critical attitude. Not that criticism is always bad, but, you know, people that come to shoot down ideas at the beginning or something like that.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Bryan, I just have two more questions before we wrap this up. So the first one
Okay.
is, what are some of the values you believe we need in a modern golden age?
I think a commitment to action and a commitment to trial and error. So basically being pretty open to the fact that if in order to have a good idea, you're going to have a lot of bad ideas. And in order for something to work, you're going to have a lot of failures. And so building a kind of tolerance or resilience or even anti-fragility around failure and saying, look, these failures are integral. Failures at the individual level of, we tried this project and it failed, or I tried, you know, this method of like meeting up or something like that and it failed. That rather than regard those as like something discouraging, regarding them as a necessary part of the project, of the process in order to improve anything. It's going to require like evolutionary forces, and that's variation and selection, and that level of selection, it is a good thing. And so kind of encouraging those small scale experiments. You should not just that you should always be failing and, you know, beating yourself up about it, but trying to set a frame where people are encouraged to try things and you just see what works without a strong expectation that everything must be well engineered and have a high chance of success. And we're spending all this time like, is this a good idea at the beginning? It's like, no, just try it, see what happens, iterate, you know?
Yeah, yeah, that's a beautiful answer. Bryan, once again, thank you so much. I really, truly, deeply enjoyed our conversation. My last question is, if people want to connect with you and to listen to your podcast, which we didn't talk about, sorry, but
Yes,
things
that's
is,
okay.
but like, where can they find you? What are some of the best places to get in touch with your work? Tell us everything.
So that's Bryan Kam, BryanKam, and that's my address, bryancam.com. You can also go to my Twitter, twitter.com//Bryan Kam. I also have a Substack. As you said, there's a podcast that's linked to on the website, and I would love to hear from anyone. So please feel free to DM me on Twitter. I would love to speak to any of your listeners.
Yeah, well, we'll definitely add all those links to the description, and you should definitely listen to Bryan's podcast. It's great. Bryan, once again, thank you so much for doing this. It was delightful, and I really hope we can talk soon. To everyone listening, this is Bryan Kemp. You should definitely follow him and listen to the podcast once again. And by the way, while you're listening to Bryan's podcast and giving it a great review on every platform that you use, maybe you want and to do the same with the Modern Golden Age podcast on Spotify or even on YouTube. And I'll see you all in the next episode. Bye.
Thank you.